I'm Nick Chiarelli. So I joined Ipsos in June, but before that I worked in consumer trends at places like Foresight Factory and in GfK and other places for 20 plus years, and in market research for, you can see from the grey hair anyway. So what we're going to show to you today is some of our latest research with global consumers, global citizens, about how they're feeling. This time of the year, it's natural to think about the year that we just had and to think ahead to the year that we hope will come. And this year, that's true even more so than ever because of the year that we had, or the years that we've had, the last two. And I think it's pretty clear, that the world is facing some profound problems. I mean, you probably saw this image from a month or so ago of this is the foreign minister of Tuvalu addressing the COP26 conference in Glasgow via video, but standing knee-deep in water just to highlight the rising sea level that are likely to affect Pacific nations and his nation in particular. But actually, and of course it's a profound issue, it's something that we'll all have to think about a lot over coming years, but the UN recognises already 22 major issues of profound importance and threat to the world. Climate change is, of course, a key one, but there are many, many others. And it says even that list of 22 is not an exhaustive list by any sense. And I'm going to mix it, I will be upfront here, so I'll mix in some personal opinion with the data that we have, try and make it clear when some is personal opinion so that we can at least have a debate, because I'm not arrogant enough to believe that my opinion is the only one. But it seems to me that we're settling into a world pattern where of extremes, where the one side can't hear sometimes what the other side is saying, whether it's to do with political opinion or leave or remain or vaccinate or don't vaccinate. That we're settling into these kind of extremes where almost a middle ground is perhaps not so much of a tenable option. You have to have an opinion, you have to be at one end or the other. And I know that doesn't sit always very well with people that like to hear both sides of the argument. But the world sometimes it seems like it's pushing into these two different directions. This is a famous quote from an American writer, Eldridge Cleaver, but it's been sort of used and abused many times over the years, that if you're not part of the solution, you must be part of the problem. So with that kind of idea of two camps, you can maybe apply that to this problem solution. Either you are part of the problem or you're part of the solution. Of course, you can a little bit be both. But with businesses, I think there's this idea that maybe that this sort of saying nothing, silence is assent. Silence means you kind of agree to just keep out of things and you're not part of the proactive solution. And actually, consumers, citizens, 70% of them around the world want or say that they believe that business leaders have a responsibility to speak out on social, political issues affecting their country. You can see it varies a lot from one country to another. There are many of the emerging markets towards the top, markets in Europe, including Denmark, down towards the bottom. But everywhere, a majority agrees actually that they're wanting the business community to step up and to express an opinion. And it's not just for the sake of it. It's also true, we believe, that successful brands are the ones who can demonstrate an empathy with their customers by relating to the same issues that they do, and demonstrating an acceptance and an empathy with their day-to-day life and their day-to-day concerns. This is the yellow wall in Dortmund. Football fans, that's one extreme example of brand loyalty. Not many people have Dell tattoos, but in the brand world it's perhaps not so extreme as it can be in the football world, but actually there is a payoff. And again, our data suggests that 70%, and again it varies hugely from one country to another, but 70% say that they tend to buy brands that reflect their own personal values. 55% say that they are generally willing to spend extra for a brand with an image that appeals to them. So if you're looking for a sort of justification on the bottom line, as well as the sort of more moral imperative of having an opinion about the things that matter, there can be that justification. It does pay off if you listen to what global consumers say, at least. So then that begs the question, of course, well, if consumers want me to show that I know what their life is like and what their concerns are like, and they want me to be active in the issues and causes that are important to them, well, what are those issues and causes? So the question then becomes, of course, if you believe the sort of premise that working in this space and being more than a provider of products and services, and being someone who has a part in the community and society, then the question then becomes, well, what are the right things to think about? So we, in our world, in our Trends and Futures group, this is our sort of model, if you like. It's compulsory, right? In marketing presentation, you have to have a model, and then we have one too. So here's ours. So when we talk about trends, what we're really talking about are changes in consumer attitudes and behaviours that give rise to some kind of changing need, and then the business or NGO or government department can react to those changing needs by changing the products and services that it offers, or the way that it communicates those products and services. But those changes don't suddenly magic up out of nowhere. People don't just wake up in the morning and say, right, I'm gonna be a trend today. They come from forces that act on all of us. So things like we call these the macro forces. There are models for this: PESTLE and STEEP. You've probably heard of. Political change, economic change, sociological change, technological, legislative, environmental. These are the forces that push down on all of us, on us as people, as citizens, as consumers, but also on governments and on businesses. So we talk about the forces, we talk about the shifts, which are the changes that happen at that kind of human level. And then we talk also about the signals, which are more the marketplace responses. So what innovation is happening. And it's interesting to see the sort of bi-directional arrows there. Sometimes the changes can be supply-led. In other words, the marketplace can be the first one to spot something and can innovate, bring a new solution to the market. The iPod's a good example. I think it's true to say back then people weren't crying out, give me an iPod, but once one was there, they could immediately see the use for it. It was a supply-led technological innovation that tapped into a need that people hadn't even articulated at that point, but sort of took off from that sense. Other times, the consumers are the first ones, or the citizens are the first ones to start wanting to live their life in a different way, and then they demand change from innovation from businesses, and the process works in that kind of direction. So what we're going to share today is bits and pieces from all of these three different buckets, if you like. I'm going to talk about some of the forces and how they're shifting, and then some of the responses from both citizens and marketers, or retailers, marketplace, if you like. So how we do that? Well, we have, I think, a global trends survey. We've been tracking publics around the world for 8 years now, since 2013, since little Prince George first came on the scene. Do you remember that, those heady days? Before we realised that not all the royals were there just to play nice, and others were there to sort of want to go to have their own life. Crazy, right? Through 2016 and the Trump years, 2019 and the sad event at Notre Dame, and in 2019, so we were doing the thing on a 3-yearly cycle at that point. In 2019, we did a big piece of sort of statistical work with the data set that we had at that time. And we developed these sort of 12 trends from this that were applicable globally. And I'm not going to speak to all of them, but there's a mixture there of things that relate to climate, that relate to health, both sort of in the sense of healthcare and disease prevention, but also more in the more general terms of well-being. Things to do with technology and data, to do with people's attitudes to globalization and global inequality. Things to do with nostalgia and the desire to live a sort of more simple, pared back kind of life. So this was our model, 12 trends in 2019. And as I say, we were at that point doing our survey on a 3-yearly kind of cycle. But then, of course, the world changed. And so we felt it was necessary and important to be tracking this more frequently. So since that point, we started to do it every year now. Sometimes in a smaller set of countries, just as a dip, if you like. But now we're doing this sort of exercise every year. This year's one was done at the back of August and into September, just so you know the kind of data we're going to show. because we're in the kind of situation now where the world is changing month by month, or even as we hear now, day by day, the rules changing. Just yesterday, many countries around the world, including the UK, which has now switched to Plan B, they're calling it. Yeah, we're only a year and a half in, and now we're on to B. So another 20 years will be at Z. Who knows, right? So, of course, we took our 12 trends, and COVID has disrupted so much. Now, I think the sort of arguments, and so much has been written about what it's going to do to us and do to our lives, fitting into two sort of broad camps, I would say. One that says, oh, this has changed everything, or COVID is killing ... is killing this market or that product sector. Another camp that says, do you know what, fundamental human needs don't really change that much. Once we settle into a pattern with this, we'll be back to doing whatever we said we were before. And of course the truth is probably somewhere in between. But we saw things written, COVID would be the death of the hug and the death of the handshake. It would be the end of kids blowing out candles on birthday parties because of blowing their germs everywhere, or ball pits, which all parents will know are sort of hotbeds of infection and nasty stuff that you don't really want to go too near. To the end of the office, the end of the city, even the end of formal business clothing, the end of commuting. The end of shared communal experiences, whether that's sort of trying on makeup samplers in department stores, or whether it's the hotel breakfast buffet or the lunch buffet kind of experience, or the festival experience, or even the end of casual hookups and one-night stands. COVID was going to be the end of all of this. Who knows? We don't know, right? Some of these things, it's clear. I don't know how many people here shook hands with people on the way in. I didn't. How these things will settle into a pattern, still to be seen. But if we start to think about what the world looks like now, we can sort of take that sort of forces and shifts model and sort of work our way through just quickly. But we can share all this material with you afterward, by the way, so in case you're sort of taking notes or pictures or whatever. But some of those forces, if we look at sort of demography, one of the things early on, people said, all this lockdown, what are people going to do? They're so bored. There's going to be a huge baby boom of what else have they got to do, right? But actually, the reverse is the case. In the US, they reckon that there'll be at least 300,000 less babies born just because of COVID, and it's because of the sort of uncertainty. People don't feel necessarily comfortable to bring a new child into a world of such uncertainty when their economic futures are so unclear, and just when they're feeling anxious and stressed and so on. So actually, this sort of baby boom, it's of course also affected global migration patterns, although those are expected to rebound in due course. But for now, of course, those have been sort of put on hold. When we look at the environment, and this is not just all COVID-related stuff. These are things happening anyway. The number of disasters happening around the world has gone up by threefold in the last 50 years. It's doubled in the last 20 years. More people affected, more disasters, more economic impact. Although interestingly, not more deaths, because we seem to be getting a bit more resilient to how we cope with these things. But in fact, the UN, the Office for Disaster Relief Reduction, advocates we don't even call them natural disasters anymore, because actually they're just a direct result of our activities. They're not human disasters, and calling them natural disasters in a way removes us from the responsibility for them. Still on the environment, resource depletion is accelerating. You may have heard of this concept called Earth Overshoot Day. It's the day in the year when we've used all of 1 year's resources. So back in 1970, we used roughly 1 year of resources in 1 year of time. December 30th was the overshoot day, so it was only 1 day of extra usage where we were dipping into our reserves of resources. Now it's July 29th, and it's been accelerating year on year, and it's something that we clearly need to reverse. If we look at some of the other drivers, inequality and income distributions, there's an interesting thing going on here where COVID has squashed countries together because it's had disproportionate effects on the more developed economies. So it's reduced inequality between nations, but it's increased inequality within nations, because obviously those have been directly affected with job layoffs and redundancies, what have you, whereas others who've been able to live on their salaries but spending less because not going out, not commuting, etc., have seen their incomes rise, and savings levels have risen a lot in many developed markets. So income inequality within markets much more extreme. And this is something you need to account for if you're marketing. You may have two totally distinct audiences with different sort of financial backgrounds based on what's happened to them over the last year. You remember this one from this picture from March, the Ever Given, blocking the Suez Canal for 6-7 days in March. But global supply chains have also been hugely affected and compromised by the situation in lockdown, and it's put a huge pressure on fulfillment systems for retailers, particularly for online distribution and so on. So that's another thing that we need to watch. Technology-wise, it's actually played hugely into the hands of the tech giants, the sort of FANGs, if you like, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google. It was estimated Amazon at one point were earning $11,000 every second during the lockdown. 35% of every pound that was spent in the UK during lockdown, 35% was to Amazon. So, but at the same time, there's been also this sort of tech backlash. Countries, railing against the taxes paid or not paid by tech giants. China banning Bitcoin. It's placing limitations around the amount of gaming time that young people can spend, just 1 hour a day at Fridays and weekends and holidays, and that's it. So there's potential for a sort of tech backlash. But at the same time, we're freer with our data. Perhaps in certain situations, we've become used to the idea that sharing our data can help manage the health crisis, and there is a school of thought that says that's going to knock on and gradually overcome some of the wariness that people have about sharing their data with corporations. But it's a two-sided story. Fake news and the sharing of data has created this sort of two-tier society with regard to vaccinations, for example, and the spread of misinformation. There was research done from the Centre for Against Online Hatred. They said they reckon that they could trace 65% of the COVID-related, vaccination-related misinformation. 65% of it could just be traced to the activities of 12 people. So this gives you an idea of how the technological world that we live in enables and facilitates the spread of misinformation. And that's obviously data is not good or bad, it's the way it's used, of course. Guns don't kill people, data doesn't kill people, it's the tools and the usage that are the issues. So that's the kind of framework that we're living in. One of the real interesting things, I think, is that people believe, 75%, people believe that the crisis has shown how quickly people can adapt their behaviour. Obviously, sometimes through mandate from governments, but also sometimes voluntarily, and also how those businesses themselves can change their behaviour. Pivot became one of the real business words of the year as we were looking to see how businesses could adapt to the new environment. But it's also very relevant, I think, because there's been this huge discussion and debate about whether we can use the pandemic as a chance to reset this build back better kind of philosophy that is part of the US policy but is also being talked about everywhere. And the idea that this change or the ability to adapt chameleon-like to this changing environment can also be used going forwards as a chance to sort of reset and rebuild a society and community that we all want when we get to the point when we can do that. The next slide, I'm going to show, but I'm aware possibly has changed already since yesterday, but this shows some data from a resource at Ipsos called What Worries the World, where we track every month global concerns of people, and you can see going back many years. So the red line there is COVID. So before, of course, it didn't exist, and then suddenly it was the number one concern everywhere. But actually, just in October, for the first time since COVID first came on the scene, for the first time it wasn't number one globally. Of course, the numbers vary hugely from one country to another, but globally it wasn't number one. And instead, things like poverty and inequality and unemployment were again number one, as they had been before. Of course, it might have changed, and Omicron is, of course, changing the situation daily. What it does suggest is that people, are kind of in a point when they're wanting to think about what comes next and wanting to think about how to move on. albeit that we still have significant challenges. I'm not saying it's over by any stretch, but people are at least in a mindset where they can think about how to move on. And of course, that's what 2022 and beyond is all about. So, with that in mind, when we came back to do this work again in September, these are our 12 trends, and the 7 actually, that jumped as being ones particularly affected by what had happened. So today I don't have time to go through 7, but these are the ones that we're really going to talk about in a bit more detail. I'm going to talk about sustainability and where things sit with regards to that, and how people are looking for a reset. We know that COP26 put it hugely onto the front of the consumer agenda. That what worries the world data that I just showed a moment ago. We do a similar thing just in the UK market called the Issues Index, and there sustainability now is the number 1 issue. It just shows how consumers are very reactive to what they see in the media, and COP obviously put everything right in the front of everybody's mind. But sustainability now number 1 in the UK. We're going to look at that. We're going to look at healthy living. We're going to look at community, because obviously lockdown pushed a big focus on local and living in a community, and many people feeling it made them see their local community in ways that they hadn't done, because previously, they'd spent more time in their local community, supported more local businesses, and just seen more of their local neighbourhood, neighbours and countryside than they had perhaps before. And then to finish off with looking at the future, particularly through the eyes of young people. So that's the agenda. We'll take the first one, and then, as I said, we'll take a very quick break for just any observations. But the first one, sustainability. So what is clear, if we take it in a sort of sequence, what is clear is that the first part of that sequence is kind of awareness and concern. And there is that concern globally. And so you can see here the sort of trend line was rising, continues to rise, perhaps slightly bit smaller, take a little bit of a sort of plateau just while we were distracted with COVID, but still at a very, very high level, and also at a very, very high level all around the world. We can talk about some of the patterns with different countries later, and it'd be interesting to see your view on where things net out. One thing I would say is with this kind of data set, you do often see emerging markets tend to be higher towards the top. Yeah.
I'm just thinking that it's a bit worried that the countries with the strongest economy are actually in the bottom of this. I mean, I think that's really worried to see that.
Yeah, well, I think
but maybe it's also because they don't have the economy to chase things, and they actually experience much more directly the impact of the changes that we see.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a number of things. One is you do anyway tend to see when you do survey work like this anyway internationally, you do often see the emerging markets more, just because people there are more extreme in their views and how they express response to surveys. So that's one part. But another part is just in some of these markets, some, not all, but say here, I'm sure there's a lower level of because people feel automatically that the government is acting in the right way, maybe less pressure. But we can debate some of these things. But the US, is perhaps a different thing. That's not, I think, the government there, but maybe they just feel in a different place, environmentally speaking. But no, you're right. I mean, it is a concern, and it's incumbent on all of us as citizens of the world to be forcing change and forcing our governments and the corporations to act in the right way, I think. But, I mean, just as a follow-on to this, I think we gave people a straight choice. Do they want companies to pay the right tax or to do as much as they can to reduce harm on the environment? I just noticed this made me laugh, because the DK here in this is not Denmark, it's don't know, just by the way. But funnily enough, Denmark is the one at the, so in the middle you have the global average, where 2/3 to 1/3 roughly people wanting, they would rather people put their focus onto the environment, people, companies, rather than taxation. In Denmark is the one with the most extreme, but even here more people would say they want to focus on the environment. But of course, the other part of it is deep down you say, well, yeah, they should be doing both, of course, right? But it's it's just a question to try to force response. But the concern is just the first part of the story. The harder thing is to see, there's, with the environment, there's this, and with many issues, this what they call the say-do gap, the gap between what I say I'm going to do and what I actually do. The do part is clearly the harder part and the crucial part. We can see that people say they're going to do. That's not the same as doing, but that's the middle between say and do. Is say I'm going to do. I say I'm willing to travel much less in future to help reduce climate change. We'd seen flu scam, as a tendency before anyway, and it'd be interesting to see to what degree the sort of health issues around travel can help to push sustainability as a behaviour. But you can see the willingness to travel, or at least to say. Of course, when it's freezing cold and you have, the possibility of some nice sunshine somewhere, that's it's a hard one. But the appetite is there, and also you can see that people believe the companies should be doing more. They're either acting too slowly or they should be encouraged to do more. There are some people that they do trust people to act for the environment, but there's more of a belief around that they should be doing more and that they should be, in a way, forced to do more by governments. And obviously this is one of the things that people look closely at COP26 to see the kind of signals for action. And obviously there was, I say obviously, but maybe not obviously, but there seemed to be feeling that many of the promises had to be watered down in order to get them through the consensus process of COP. But actually, we can all operate at a more local level to force and drive the change that we want to see. In terms of so some of these signals then, we can look at what the marketplace is doing. And there are hundreds of signals in this sustainability space. I picked out a few. So start with the one on the right. This is corn. This is I don't know if you have this brand here, but it's a mycoprotein, a fungal protein that can be used as a meat replacement. It's been around for 20, 30 years. But they started now to put on their packaging the carbon footprint. So to produce a kilo of corn, it costs 1.3 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. They put that on the pack, and that's a good step, I think. Of course, you can then say, is 1.3, is that good? Is that bad? I mean, what does it mean? So that's not enough on its own, but it's a start, right? And actually, this one on the left, it's called HEAL label. So HEAL is HEAL, which is health, environment, animals, and labour. So it gives each product a ranking, sort of traffic lighting kind of system on those 4 dimensions. So at least it's trying to make things visible. But of course, not every product is assessed by the app. But it's that kind of visibility that I think is important to consumers, because it's such a confusing issue to know whether you're buying in a good way or you're buying in a bad way, because you just don't know. And while people like Corn are trying good steps, maybe the numbers in themselves are not enough to know whether that's... What I would, just as an aside, if you're interested in this stuff, there's a great book called How Bad Are Bananas? That's really good, just so you can read the sort of different impacts of different things in your life. I think it's probably not a surprise that the most environmentally damaging thing any of us can do in our lives is have children. That's the number one. Then long haul flying, then da-da-da. It goes through all of those different things and kind of tries to put numbers around them. But this kind of awareness and education thing, I think, is a really important thing. Then the next thing we see, of course, is a lot of this pledging activity. So many companies, saying they'll become net zero or even net positive by this date or that date. And yeah, that's great. But again, you'd argue that many of those pledges could be more aggressive, could be more, those timeframes could be different. The climate pledge is something, I'm going to show a little film just now after this, but it's a sort of group that was set up by Amazon and in partnership with a non-profit group called Global Optimism to try to accelerate the promises in the Paris Agreement and bring them forward. That's what the climate pledge is all about. This was a film that aired in the UK around that. I think it's quite, and it's sort of quite nice and emotional in terms of young people's commitment and role in all of this. Great. So just as we sort of finish on this piece, just going to step into some thoughts which are personal opinion as much as anything, but it'd be great sort of starting point for debate for a minute or two. Personally, I think where we're at with this is that people are looking for businesses to step up voluntarily or through mandate from government, looking for them to do more than just the minimum they can get away with, and doing it not because they can justify it through the bottom line in any kind of way, but to do it because it's the right thing to do. And again, very much from a personal point of view, I mean, I'm tired of seeing lots of advertising from companies telling me how amazing they are in their sustainable behaviours. I'd rather they took that money and put it into doing more stuff. And just, if I want to find out, what brand X is doing on sustainability, I can find it on their website, no problem. I don't need a £1 million ad campaign to tell me what they're doing. I'd rather they put that £1 million to doing the next thing. That's just a personal view. So yeah, I guess we have a minute or two just before we step into the next, just for any thoughts from the floor. Yeah.
I think the whole sustainability labeling is a little bit tricky because it's very, very, as far as I understand, very, very complex to figure out the footprint on the label, while at the same time making it very digestible for the consumer. There's a lot of talk about in Denmark around politicians and certain politicians in particular are really focused on this, but it's just it seems to be very difficult labeling to achieve through the whole sort of supply chain. Do you have any thoughts on how to, if it's even possible to do such a thing, or if there is this is the best thing we can get at, or any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I don't have a magic answer, because I think part of the problem is companies wary of putting too much out there for fear of litigation or action, because their claims can be micro-analysed. I think consumers, instead of just looking for big buckets, is it really, really bad, or really, just looking for that kind of simple, actionable stuff. They're not so they can live a totally purist monk-like existence, but just so they can make trade-offs where relevant and make no okay, today I'm buying this, which is perhaps not so good. Other times I can make that gap up somewhere else. But you're absolutely right, it is really, really hard. But I mean, I think the answer is perhaps not in that numerical stuff like corn. It's more just in sort of simple steps, and just maybe it's away from brands, but maybe it's more in a space of really big kind of conceptual ideas about the kinds of things, people's awareness around meat production, for example. Some of the basics just isn't there for ordinary citizens about just how damaging meat and dairy are as a global phenomenon, for example. I don't mean to pick on those two particularly, but there are, people just don't really understand perhaps the sort of implications of any of the stuff that they do. So I'd like to see, the climate change pledge is an interesting thing because it's a collaborative effort across brands. I think there's examples where I think we're at a point where brands need to step away from the idea that any of this is to do with competitive advantage, that I'm more green than the other guy. It's not like that. It's about, we should all, they should be sharing best practice across each other. They should be all saying that we all are in this together, and I'm not going to use this as a way to make advantage over my competitor because I'm more green than they are, so I can sell more product than they can. Because that whole thing is a circular, divisive kind of argument. Selling more product is because you're more sustainable. I mean, how does that even work? That's the sort of, you get. All right, well, let's step on, because we can also take questions more generally at the end as well. So we still have a bit to get through. So the second big bucket of stuff is around healthy living. And when I say second bucket, it's not even like that, of course. All of these things are related to each other, because healthy living is increasingly being conceptualized as planetary health, not just personal health. But just to step through some of the sort of stats on some of this, people are in a place, while we've been battling with a health crisis, worse than any in living memory, people have also been aware of the sort of broader issues, some of which pre-existed COVID anyway, the need to just do more to look after themselves. You can see this, I'm not going to read the stats, you can read them. The idea that they'd like more control over decisions about their health, both in a general sort of sense about health and well-being and exercise and fitness and good eating practices, and in a sort of healthcare specific way. But we can also know that the COVID has had a specific impact on health. Again, this is sort of polarization of society where 20% claim, they've said they've lost weight through lockdown. Perhaps not commuting has given them more time to exercise, for example. Whereas more people, have said being locked in has made them put on weight. They're just reaching for that donut and while watching Squid Game or whatever, right? So, and saying that, if people place a great deal of importance on their health, to such a degree that they say they would sacrifice convenience if it means getting healthier products. And yet
Yeah, so could you elaborate a little bit on, for example, the extreme high China numbers, or the France, it's 76.
In this chart here,
No, previous.
Yeah, the last slide on the left.
which one? In the middle?
On the left,
On
we have China at 98.
Yeah, no, I'm not really aware of the specific situation in China. I mean, we can talk to our Chinese colleagues and find out what's going on there. But it seems clear that we know anyway that emerging markets do place generally higher importance on lots of these kind of issues. But no, I'm not.
Because they can influence it.
Yeah.
Their health is just important to survive.
Yeah. Yeah. The next part of it is that they know also, again, there's this sort of gap. So here we talk about, should the government really be involved with this, through things like sugar taxes and price management systems and perhaps government-led communications initiatives around healthy eating, for example. So in the blue, should it be the government's responsibility, or actually should the government sort of step away from this? And you can see globally it's a mix. There's more saying actually the government should be doing something, and that's particularly high in that's Indonesia, particularly low in the US. Denmark is more on the not interfere side, 43% not interfere versus 33% wanting some sort of government influence. But I think again this is clear where it's an idea that ordinary consumers, this kind of statement in their mind is a psychological get out clause or barrier to them. I don't have to do it. The government should really be helping me do this. It's not up to me what I put into my body. It's the government. It's this kind of sort of step away from responsibility. But clearly, it is something that there is this sort of circular or this multifaceted area of ownership of this. We can all drive our own health, but at a societal level, we need societal health to be improved, and it's less of an individual issue, or it's an individual issue, but it's also a societal one. So they're looking. Consumers want to be healthy. Just to step back, they want to be healthy. Many of them think the government should be acting more, and the other thing is that many of them think actually that there can be a big role for technology. This particular data point is a bit more extreme around the curability of diseases. But I think it's an interesting window into our sort of relationship with technology and our belief in science, which has, as you can see, it varies a lot from one country to another, albeit being said, but it has, through COVID, has actually taken another step up. Obviously, people have seen the global collaboration around vaccine production, the global collaboration around scientific effort around understanding the disease in terms of treating and prevention. And I think there is this, while many on a personal level, our relationship with technology on one hand is a love-hate thing with the device side of technology, without too much time spent on screens and what have you. But at a broader level, there is this underlying support and belief in the power of science to solve our problems. But you can argue, of course, that's another way of just sort of stepping away from responsibility. If only I had the right app, then I'd live healthily, this kind of thing. And we do, of course, see a lot of innovation in this space. So Apple, for example, in the US have now, there's a button to click, permission button, where you can share your Apple Health data with your healthcare professionals. And of course, we know that that's it's a sort of big sort of grey area in terms of uses and misuses of that data, in terms of what if it got to your insurance provider or your employer that you have this kind of health issue or that kind of health issue. So of course there's a lot of legislative grey area around some of this stuff, but Apple are at least trying to enable people, if they want to embrace some of the positive aspects of data sharing from a health management issue. So of course, there's huge issues around sort of data management and data. But on a more mundane level, you have other examples like this Matanet, which is just a sort of drone delivery system for drugs and PCR tests and such like through Abu Dhabi. So they're shuttling back and forth through the skies of Abu Dhabi through drones, and of course, that's another side of technology in terms of fulfillment of orders through prescription, automatic prescription sharing and renewals and so on. So there's a big role for technology in driving healthier lifestyles. Again, I have a little film here. I'll just introduce it quickly. I put it in here, but it's also a sustainability story. It's from the UK. It's from Sainsbury's, and the premise of this, they use a word that doesn't really exist. It's called halfist. Half, H-A-L-F. And what it's about is this idea of mixing half of your diet with meat and with non-meat as a sort of stepping stone towards full meat-free diets. And I think that's an interesting premise, because that again, a lot of our data suggests people are away from the extremes, living of course, veganism. Levels of veganism aren't rising that far, but levels of flexitarian living are really rising very, very rapidly, and I think that fits that better sort of middle ground of where people really want to live their life. So I'll quickly show the film. So I think that's, and I think it's interesting because of this sort of halfway house kind of solution, that I think it just feels a little bit easier for people to aspire to. But I also like it because it's this interesting overlap space between healthy on a personal level, but healthy on a planetary level. I think it's kind of interesting, and I expect to see a lot more in that sort of space. Oh, please, yeah.
Just a thought, because I mean, at the beginning there was something about keeping people being more extreme in their beliefs, so you are either for or against. But then, if we look at how people actually, how they actually act in the real world, it's more like the hardest part.
That's a really good
So
point.
I mean, I think that's really interesting, especially also when you talk about branding your company and your company products, that you have to fit into kind of the very strong belief, but still underpin the hardest work or the way of living, basically.
Yeah, that's a really good observation.
Yeah.
I think the difference with the beginning is that a lot of that exists in that social media world where it's about extremely entrenched positions, in that sort of social media context where people are talking and debating. But I think in terms of the challenge for brands to live in both of those worlds, I think you can clearly state your long-term goal to be pushing towards the extremely good behaviour, but recognising the challenges that many people face to make that jump all in one go. So maybe that the halfist is a good example of saying, well, we recognise that jump is perhaps too far to say you're going to cut meat out totally, but we're going to help
Sort of
you
eating
with
the
ideas.
elephant in small bites.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but I think that's a great observation, actually. Cool. All right. So if we just crack on the next one, then two more. So the next one is about community and unity. So here we can talk about sort of the role of local versus global, but also sort of divisions more generally, and sort of things like quality, diversity, inclusion, those kind of issues will all fit within this sort of broad bucket. So firstly, just to start with a positive here for change, I mean, people fundamentally believe in humanity. I'd say 73% people believe across the world have more things in common than they have that make them different. However, that there are, of course, many challenges. So people recognise income inequality, and we know, we've this is AOC in the US is tax the rich. Address got a lot of attention earlier in the year. And we know that income inequality has been growing and has been, in fact, increased by the pandemic. People recognise the sort of conflict between people that don't share the same values, perhaps in that social media space particularly, but when you get, I mean, Heineken, I don't know if you remember from about 5 years ago now when they did that thing, Unite the World, I don't know if you remember that, where they got a lot of attention at the time, and it's still on YouTube if you want to find it, where they brought people of opposing views to come together over a Heineken and sort of discuss back and forth, and luckily they didn't actually kick hell out of each other. They actually generally did debate the issues back and forth, but there is still this feeling about division, and across the world the feeling that racism and other forms of intolerance are still present in societies. People do, however, of course, they don't want that to be the case by and large. But, there are shades here. It's still interesting to me, with my liberal Western head, that 59% can say there are too many immigrants in my country, and yet, the population story from earlier, many Western countries having declining birth rates are going to need immigration in order to drive their economy. But obviously a lot of people don't necessarily tap into that. There's still that feeling for many of job loss and threat and different and all of that sort of stuff. So there is still this sort of sense of division. So there are real sort of shades of different camps here. People saying they in terms of gender and transgender men and women should be free to live as they want. People saying or not saying that people of different backgrounds are treated fairly. So there's this real sort of spectrum of opinion. And again, this is a real space where brands can really be active. I'm not going to talk through all of these. We'll share this after. You can look at them. The one that got a lot of attention, I think, is Uncle Ben, or Ben's now as it's known, the rice brand, with a really an image of an old black man that's been used on its packaging for generations, now taking that away and saying it's not appropriate. It's not something that sort of that fits with the way they want to view the world. Lego, Everyone's Awesome campaign. PlayStation have put a new sort of skin over for Black Lives Matter. So this is really a space where brands are increasingly keen to operate. And going back to that thing at the beginning about that's what consumers are looking for brands to do, to step up and to embrace the issues that are important to consumers themselves. There's another side to this as well, which is the sort of global local. So globalization, on balance, people feel globalization is a good thing, and that global brands make better products than those are available and local just to my own country. But of course, that's far more prevalent in emerging markets. It's far, and it's perhaps not too surprising to see a market like France right at the bottom of that list. As a Brit, I won't say any more than that. But through the pandemic, we've seen this rise in appreciation of the local. Now, more a citizen of the world than my country is exactly in balance with those that don't, that think the opposite of that. People are feeling that their local area is a place where people of different backgrounds can get on, some people wanting to buy local products. So there's been this real sort of shift back towards local, because we've all turned inwards. And of course that's open for discussion about how long that will perpetuate as we start to look outwards once we can. So there's been some nice examples here. This is Jumbo checkouts. They basically just allocated some of their checkouts to being discussion point checkouts. Others where you can just breeze through and the person at the checkouts sort of trained not to engage with you too much. Others where you can deliberately stop to chat because of this role that supermarkets can play as sort of local centres of aggregation and focus. So you can use stores and local touch points as ways to build sense of community, hold events around local stores, and so on. The other example is Tom's, the footwear brand, which has always sort of had this buy one give one kind of model. Here, this is a particular initiative around creating local advocate communities amongst its sort of as brand ambassadors and as community ambassadors, and that's something they put a lot of effort and money into. And then just at 10 with a film again. This one's from Google. Now, just to set this up, it's a part of their hashtag Dear Local. So the idea here is they're trying to promote the idea that when you check in to local businesses, and you should be giving reviews and on Google, of course, but so you can to build that local businesses' online profile, and it uses the actress Sheridan Smith. Okay, so that's a good example of just, I think there's this sort of twofold nature to this story about lessening division within society more broadly, across sort of racial, gender, sexuality, income lines, but also supporting local businesses where you can, and enabling your business to work locally as well as being something that's just perhaps more national or international. So then the last big one is around the idea of the future. So just to set this up, I mean, basically, and you can see this through recessions in the past, and difficult sort of crises through the past. When the here and now is really grim, you basically have these sort of two possibilities psychologically. One is to look forward to when things are going to get better. The other one is to look backwards to when, in your mind, they were better. So you always see this sort of big uptick of nostalgia around when you have economic difficulties or other difficulties. So here you see through the data here, that given the choice, I'd prefer to have grown up at a time when my parents were children, and that's really sad. I mean, to me, that's a really sad, and you can see this through the data. Globally, the yes and the no to this is roughly in balance, but even the fact that that's the case is pretty sad, I think. Further than that, you can see this sort of psychological phenomenon called rosy retrospection, which is basically nostalgia. The summers were always hotter, the ice cream was always tastier, whatever, right? The world's changing too fast. I wish my life was simpler. I wish my country was the way it used to be. And here I've used the British cricket on the village green example that kind of probably drove a lot of the Brexit feeling, misplaced as it was, in my opinion. But then it's not just, so you have this looking back to the past. The other reason why looking back to the past is so appealing is that the other one of those possibilities, looking ahead to the future, is so shrouded in uncertainty and difficulty. So, this idea, this is some online work from the Guardian newspaper, just sort of some more interview qualitative work. But, very few young people feel that their generation will have a better life than their parents. And that's a very difficult thing to grow up knowing, because we've always had predicated on us this sort of assumption of progress and of betterment and, of moving forward. And the idea that might not be the case. This generation might be the very first one to live with that kind of feeling. And that's a very difficult thing, potentially for long-term planning, for investing, for settling down, buying a house, but any kind of long-term commitments is really difficult in that kind of environment. And so it's certain that this group will need considerable support from all of us, not just literal support through the bank of mum and dad, but emotional support in terms of how to actually cope in that kind of setting, because they'd be the only ones really to have gone through that. So again, there are a number of examples of what people are doing. The Moves Collective is based around the gig economies, where so many young people find their first steps into employment through this sort of partial employment models. But those are, as you know, so fraught with uncertainty in terms of planning and how many hours you're going to get and all of that. So the Moves Collective is that's based in Toronto. It's just an example where they're trying to boost the power and influence of its drivers by giving them sort of shares in the startup. So it's just an example of just trying to make the gig economy actually a bit more solid and a bit more reliable and a bit more grounded in certainty, which is really not the case generally. And then this other one is from something called Starling Bank, trying to give young people a seat at the table, a voice, particularly related to sustainability. It's a nice sort of set of online films that I would recommend you take a look at. But it's this idea, at least, of giving young people a voice and a role in driving their futures, which of course they deserve and must have if they're to feel that the world they create is one that's going to work for them. Got a film to show. This is a bit of a longish one, but this is from the Smithsonian, who've got a wonderful futures exhibition again, that's all online, so you can take a look at that. I'll stop that there, but I would recommend you take a look. It's it divides up into sort of actionable concepts around innovations for the future, futures that work, but also some of the more emotional sides of the future, futures that inspire, and also recognising the lessons from the past, so futures past, and how the future was envisaged in the past, and sort of help inform how we think about our own future. So I definitely would recommend that you take a look. But I think in terms of, we are at a point where there is this sort of feeling within people about wanting to start to look forward. I mean, we always do to some degree, and we always do at this time of year, like I said at the beginning. But now more than ever, there's this real feeling of kind of had enough of all of this. And I know that it's likely we have to take a bit of a side step before we can take that forward step. But people are ready to start taking that forward step. I think we've seen huge amounts of messaging around nostalgia, but to me, I can see why, but I think that's less healthy. It's possible of an easy win for brands to sort of kind of embrace people in this warmth of nostalgia, but from all of our sakes, I think we need to step into this more challenging area of wanting to think about the difficult area of the future, and that's where brands, I think, it's a bit of a harder conversation to have, but it's probably a more relevant one, a more helpful one in the long term. So that's what I'd advocate for brands to sort of try to step into. The last one is if, where you have opportunities to sort of build certainty into your product offering, that would really help for young people in particularly if your product space is one with long-term commitment, with big financial, big price tickets, for example. So Kia, for example, had this sort of buyback insurance built into their purchase price now if you lost your job through COVID, for example. That's just one example. But if you can bring that kind of certainty into spaces, not just from a revenue generation point of view, not just from trying to encourage people to actually part with their money at a difficult time, but from the point of view of the emotions of your consumers, of helping them actually to start thinking longer term rather than just what's happening next week. That would also be quite helpful, I think. So just where do we end up with this? Well, actually, we were surprised when we looked at the data. A lot of things that we're talking about in the Global Trends Survey are sort of quite deep-rooted fundamental values, and actually the evidence is along the lines that those things don't fundamentally change. We were surprised there was a bit more continuity than we expected. Some of the stories from before COVID have been continued, so the climate change, climate concern, what we now need is for that concern to tip far more into action. But the concern is still there, and the concern hasn't really been affected too much by COVID. Brand purpose, focus on health, this issue about getting the balance between global and local right, and creating this sort of sense of belief in the long-term future. I'll just finish with this sort of somewhat trite kind of quote, but the most reliable way to predict the future is for you to be actively involved in creating it rather than just to let it happen around you. So hopefully there's some interesting things, some things to think about actually going to next year. We'll just remind you that all of this is backed up by a big global data set, so we can dive right into what the situation is here or in any other markets that are of interest to you, and not just for everybody, but for specific demographic groups that might be part of your target audience. But yeah, that's it from me. Let's have some questions and some observations and some discussion. Thank you very much.